For most of history, power followed a familiar path. Control land, command soldiers, place a crown on someone's head, and wealth would eventually flow your way. Venice never fit that pattern. It had no king, no farmland, and no feudal army guarding wide borders. It rose from shallow water and unstable mud, supported by wooden pilings, driven into a lagoon. By every medieval standard, it should have failed. Yet for centuries, emperors, popes, crusaders, and kings relied on Venice not for troops or territory, but for something far more influential: financial trust. Venice did not dominate the world through conquest. It financed it, and in doing so, it helped create the foundations of the financial system we still depend on today. To understand how Venice became a bank rather than a kingdom, you have to see how different it was from the rest of Europe. Medieval power was rooted in land. Land produced food, food sustained people, and people could be taxed and sent to war. Feudalism organized society around this chain. Venice had no such base. Its islands could not support large-scale agriculture, and its geography made traditional invasion difficult but also made territorial expansion meaningless. Instead of building castles and claiming fields, Venice built ships. Instead of expanding borders, it expanded connections. Power came not from holding territory, but from controlling movement of goods, information, and money. From early on, Venice positioned itself as a connector between worlds that did not trust each other. Trade goods from Asia, the Islamic world, and Europe passed through Venetian hands. Different languages, religions, and currencies met in its ports. Venice did not need to dominate these regions politically. It only needed to make itself indispensable to their exchange. This role became formalized in its relationship with the Byzantine Empire. While Venice technically acknowledged Byzantine authority, it operated with remarkable independence. That balance shifted decisively in the late 11th century, when Venice was granted sweeping trade privileges and tax exemptions in return for naval support. The message was clear. The empire depended on Venice more than Venice depended on the empire. From that point on, Venice stopped paying for access and started being paid with it. Unlike monarchies built around a single ruler, Venice avoided concentrating power in one person. There was no king to overthrow and no dynasty to manipulate. Authority was distributed through councils, laws, and procedures designed to limit individual ambition. This was not democracy in the modern sense, but it was deliberate system design. Venice did not place its faith in divine right or popular passion. It placed its faith in process. This institutional mindset shaped Venice's social structure. In much of medieval Europe, merchants were tolerated but disrupted. Wealth earned through trade was seen as morally suspect, and real status came from land ownership and warfare. Venice reversed that hierarchy. There was no entrenched landed nobility. The people who owned ships, managed trade routes, and calculated risk were not outsiders, they were the ruling class. Economic competence was not something to hide. It was the basis of legitimacy. Wealth stayed in motion, reinvested into fleets, ports, and institutions rather than frozen into estates. Over time, merchant families naturally became political leaders. Governance was handled by people accustomed to managing long-term risk and complex systems. Stability mattered more than spectacle. That structure hardened at the end of the 13th century, when access to the main governing council was restricted to established families. Political power became hereditary, but it was hereditary commercial power, not feudal nobility. Venice was not ruled by bloodlines of conquest, but by balance sheets and contracts. The system was intentionally conservative, designed to prevent sudden shifts in personal domination. Short terms, layered oversight, and harsh penalties for abuse all served the same goal: preserving credibility. Once merchants fully shaped the state, Venice itself began to behave differently from other governments. It stopped acting like a warlord, extracting wealth, and started acting like a manager of risk. The state did not stand above finance, it embedded itself within it. Money was no longer just collected and spent. It was organized. Trust was no longer assumed. It was engineered. This shift laid the groundwork for Venice's most important innovation: the deliberate use of public debt. In most medieval states, borrowing was a sign of desperation. Rulers turned to loans only when wars were already going badly. Venice treated borrowing as a tool, not a last resort. When the state needed funds, it issued mandatory loans to wealthy citizens. These obligations paid interest and could be traded. What looked like coercion evolved into opportunity. Citizens became creditors. Their personal wealth became directly tied to the survival and stability of the state. Loyalty was no longer enforced primarily by fear or ideology, but by financial incentive. This was public debt centuries before it became normal. Venice understood that trust was its most valuable asset and guarded it fiercely. Defaults were avoided. Payments were honored. Credibility was protected because, once trust collapses, financial systems unravel faster than armies can invade. Debt was not treated as a weakness, but as a binding force that aligned private interest with public stability. To make this system work, Venice also had to solve a practical problem: how to move money safely and efficiently. Transporting gold and silver across dangerous seas was slow and risky. The solution was to reduce the importance of metal altogether. When Venice established a state-controlled bank, money increasingly became an entry in a ledger rather than a physical object. Transactions could be settled through accounting rather than coins. This reduced fraud, lowered risk, and accelerated commerce. Money became lighter, faster, and more abstract. This was not reckless innovation. It was disciplined control. The Venetian financial system was tightly regulated. Speculation was restricted, and financial misconduct was treated as a serious crime. The city was not selling excitement or rapid growth, it was selling reliability. Predictability mattered more than dramatic profits. For centuries, that approach worked. As Venice's political power faded, its ideas did not disappear. They migrated. Other cities adopted and refined them. States learned to borrow permanently rather than occasionally. Financial power became increasingly detached from physical resources and tied instead to credibility. Modern governments no longer dominate because they hold the most gold, but because markets believe they will honor their obligations. Bonds, currencies, and financial institutions rest on shared confidence rather than metal. This is where the Venetian lesson becomes uncomfortable. Systems built on trust are powerful but fragile. They require discipline and accountability. When those weaken, confidence must be constantly propped up. Venice understood that stability has a cost. Over time, its caution became rigidity. Innovation slowed. New trade routes bypassed the city. The system endured, but growth stagnated. Venice did not collapse, suddenly it aged. The deeper truth Venice leaves behind is that money is never neutral. It reflects who is trusted, who is protected, and who bears the cost when confidence breaks. Empires do not fail because they run out of money. They fail when people stop believing that money represents anything real. Venice shaped the world not through armies, but by organizing incentives better than anyone else of its era. It turned trust into infrastructure and finance into governance, whether we recognize it or not. Much of the modern financial world still operates inside the framework Venice built centuries ago.